What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode for Best Bets for UFC Rio Charles Oliveira versus Mateusz Gamrot, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. Hope you guys are having a great day. Let's dive in with the most confident picks of the week. We got Julia Polastri, Valter Walker, and Joel Alvarez. Starting with Julia, she's fighting Karolina Kowalkiewicz, who is nearing the end of her competitive run. At 38, her performances have declined noticeably. She once endured a 5-fight losing streak before rebounding with a 4-fight win streak against older, lower level opponents. But now that she's matched with younger, faster, more athletic fighters again, she's dropped her last 2 fights. And at this stage, she no longer is evolving as an athlete, and we've seen uh her ceiling, right? Julia, meanwhile, she's the opposite. She's young, she's hungry, she's improving. Her losses have come against proven high-level talent like Jasmine Jastovicius and Lupita Goldenese. Fighters known for their toughness and pace. Against anyone below that level, Julia has looked sharp. And she's technical, she's aggressive, she's dangerous both on the feet and on the ground. And Carolina, on the other hand, she struggled whenever she's faced opponents who can push a high tempo or combine athleticism with volume striking. Stylistically, both women here, they come forward and they apply pressure, but Julia is the more dynamic striker. She's faster, she hits cleaner, and she maintains a higher pace. Even in her loss to Lupita Goldenese, Julia showed grit. She fought back. She fought back hard in the later rounds, landing clean shots and refusing to fade. And that resilience and drive stand in contrast to Carolina, who often slows down under pressure. During her 5-fight skid, she consistently wilted when opponents dictated the pace. And her own words back in 2019. She admitted her best years were behind her, and that was 6 years ago, and those words still ring true today. This matchup should largely play out on the feet, and in that area, Julia holds the edge in speed, aggression, and accuracy. Carolina's defense has always been pretty poor, and Julia's forward moving combinations are likely to find their mark often here. With age, reflexes, and durability all declining, I think Carolina faces an uphill battle against a younger fighter eager to make a statement, in this division. I expect Julia to control the exchanges, outwork her in volume and overwhelm her when as the fight progresses. Polastri, she's young, she's aggressive, she has cleaner boxing, and she has a gritty pace and strong cardio. Carolina, she's 38 years old. She's hittable, she's declining in speed and durability. So I expect Julia to push the pace, overwhelm the older veteran with volume and her youth. So, moving on to our next most confident pick, Valter Walker. Valter, the Foot Hunter Walker, is back, and the nickname couldn't be more fitting. This man is a nightmare for anyone who lets him anywhere near their legs. His heel hooks are vicious. Once he locks it in, uh, the pain and immediate, the pain is immediate, and it's fight ending. You can see on his opponent's faces the moment he grabs hold of their legs. 3 straight victory wins in a row by heel hook. It's almost unheard of at this level. What he did to Kennedy and Juku, that was kind of shocking. He snatched that leg and ended the fight under a minute. And Kennedy's no walk in the park. And Walker as well, he's not just a submission threat. He's a finisher, plain and simple. He shows up to end his fights, not win decisions. And now he's facing Mohammed Usman, who's looked average at best. Usman is a big, strong guy, but his striking output is low. He's slow to pull the trigger, and he doesn't have great takedown defense either. Thomas Peterson took him down multiple times with ease. And you can say Usman has that natural raw power. But against someone as mobile and calculated as Walker, it's hard to imagine him landing clean shots on Walker. Walker's durability and footwork make him a tough target, and his ability to close the distance and control opponents in the clinch gives him a clear path to victory here. Even if this fight stays standing, which I do think it will because of what Valter Walker has been saying, Walker won't be out of his comfortability. His striking is solid enough to hold its own in this, especially in this matchup, especially against someone as hesitant as Usman, but once he gets inside, that's really where I see him taking over, using his size, strength, and creativity to drag this fight into his world if things go south in the striking. I expect Walker to close the distance, work in the clinch, fire off sharp knees, and eventually drag Usman down to the mat. From there, it's only a matter of time before he gets a submission or gets ground and pound finish. Usman will be swinging for the knockout, but Walker's movement and composure make it unlikely that he'll get caught. And once those heavy shots start to miss from Usman, the fight shifts completely into Walker's favor. Walker is he's too dangerous everywhere. He's too confident right now, and he's too good at pulling you into his own traps. Don't be surprised if he makes it 4 heel hooks in a row, because Walker's massive, but he's agile as well. He's dangerous with his submissions, he's dangerous on the feet, and his striking is improving as well. And then you got Usman, who's slow, low output, he's hittable, and he has poor defensive grappling. I think this is Valter Walker all day. I think he's going to close the distance, get him in the clinch, either heel hook him or get another, or get a knockout victory here. Moving on to our next most confident pick, Yoel Alvarez. We got to include Yoel Alvarez in this fight. Whenever Alvarez steps in the cage, it's must watch action. He's a finishing machine, dynamic, dangerous, and incredibly well-rounded. Currently riding a 3-fight finishing streak. His last 7 wins have all been by finish. His most recent knockout of Drakkar Klose was especially brutal. He showed how sharp his striking has become. And the only blemish in his last 8 bouts is a loss to Arman Tsarukyan, a world-class contender who was on the verge of a title shot. Losing to someone like that is nothing to be ashamed of at all. Other than that, he's looked perfect in his UFC career. Now he's matched with Vicente Luque, who's gone just 2-4 in his last 6. His only recent wins came over Themba Gorimbo and RDA, Rafael Dos Santos. These are solid names, but far from elite at this point. Meanwhile, his submission loss to Kevin Holland for Vicente Luque exposed the fact that Luque is not quite the same relentless brawler he once was. Since his brain bleed scare, he's fought more cautiously, avoiding the wild exchanges, and those wild exchanges are what used to make him so dangerous. When things start to go south in his recent fights, he's looked more hesitant than ever. As seen in his loss to Joaquin Buckley, where he couldn't adjust once the striking started to slip, he pretty much just gave up. He gave in. He said, "The fight is yours. I'm done fighting." Alvarez, on the other hand, is just now entering his prime. He's huge for even this division. He's going to be a lot bigger than Vicente Luque, and he's slick on the mat, lethal in transitions. His submissions are elite, his ground and pound are vicious, and his striking continues to evolve with each fight. He carries real knockout power and is so explosive. He has the reach and length to dictate range against almost anyone. Excuse me. In his current form, Yoel Alvarez should have every advantage here. Luque still has strong fundamentals, and he has the heart. Well, I wouldn't say he still has the heart, because we've seen him kind of give up. But the aggression and fearlessness that defined his prime just aren't there anymore. Against a bigger, sharper, more confident finisher like Alvarez, it's too tough to see him keeping up with Alvarez. I expect Joel to take control early, punish Luque at range, and finish him. Whether it's a crisp combination on the feet or a tight submission once it hits on the mats, I'm banking he finishes it. I'm saying it's going to be a knockout. Luque, he doesn't have the same durability he once has as a vet in this sport. He's slowed down post-surgery. He's hesitant, and it just looks like he's declining. 2-4 in his last 6. Coming up against a tall, slick finisher, elite submissions, and powerful striking Yoel Alvarez, I think Alvarez is going to be much longer, much fresher, overwhelms Luque with pace and his length and his strength. So that concludes the most confident picks. Moving on to the lock of the week. Lock of the week, we got Vitor Petroni. Look, I think Petroni is going to dominate this matchup. I feel like the only path to victory for Thomas Peterson here is to lay on Petroni for 3 rounds, you know? He has to survive the first round, and then he has to take down Petroni without taking any damage in rounds 2 and 3. I just think Petroni is going to be a lot quicker, way more athletic than anyone Peterson has faced, you know? And if you look at Peterson's losses, Peterson doesn't present any real danger in terms of Petroni's vulnerabilities. You know, we saw Anthony Smith lock in a guillotine after Petroni shot in for a takedown. I don't think Peterson is going to do that. You know, his arm, it's literally like too fat to get under Petroni's neck. And what is Peterson going to knock out Petroni late in the third round? I highly doubt that. Like the way Dustin Jacoby did. You know, Peterson, he's a pure wrestler. He's big. He's kind of sloppy on the feet. You know, it's decent boxing, but nothing compared to what Petroni has shown, you know? Petroni is a pure wrestler, and on the feet, I just don't think it will be close at all. You know, we saw Petroni handle his last opponent with some grappling, so we know he's been working on that, and it's looking good. You know, I think it's good enough to have him use his athleticism here to dictate where this fight takes place, whether it's on the feet or reversing positions and going for takedowns. And if you just look at Petroni and then look at Peterson, you know, I'm not trying to be mean or anything. Just look at their physiques. Look at their aura. You know, Peterson looks like a middle-aged man. He looks like a middle-aged, divorced father of 6 looking for the hot dog stand and accidentally wandered into the octagon. And Petroni looks like a juggernaut ready to go berserk mode, you know? And I love Peterson. You know, I think he's a great guy. He's a hardworking man. He's a family man. Seems like a great guy. But as a fighter coming up against Petrino, I just think he's in trouble. You know, I can already picture Petroni getting a knockout victory here. You know, the guy's an absolute powerhouse. And it's unfortunate for Thomason because he's a solid fighter and seems like a great guy, but stylistically, this is a rough matchup for him. And Peterson, he's not a bad fighter, you know, by any means. He's strong, he's gritty, and he has a clear, he's clearly a wrestler, you know, but I think Vitor operates on another level. He's faster, more athletic, and far more dangerous everywhere the fight goes. You know, Peterson's game is always the same, you know? It's shoot for takedowns. I'm kind of sick. Shoot for takedowns repeatedly and grind opponents out. And that approach works against slower, less mobile fighters. But when he faces someone who can move well, defend takedowns, and strike with power, he tends to struggle. You know, and Petroni is easily the most athletic and explosive opponent he's faced, right? The man is built like a tank. He hits like a freight train and has proven he can grapple as well. You know, just look at his first round submission over in his last fight. You know, so Vitor's 2 career losses came from mistakes rather than being outclassed. You know, getting caught in a guillotine after shooting carelessly against Anthony Smith and getting clipped late against Justin Jacoby in a fight that he was actually winning. You know, those moments seem to have matured him as a fighter, and now he's showing his composure, improved defense, and a more balanced understanding of when to engage and when to stay patient, you know? His mix of raw power, athleticism, and refined fight IQ make him one of the more dangerous prospects in this division right now, in the heavyweight division, you know? And as for this matchup, I think Vitor's strength and speed will allow him to dictate where the fight takes place. He should be able to stuff Peterson's takedowns, win the clinch battles, and land clean power shots on the feet. And Peterson, he needs those takedowns to win. You know, it's his bread and butter. But against someone as explosive as Vitor, I don't see him securing many takedowns, if any. You know, once his takedowns start failing, he'll be stuck in the striking exchanges. He'll be stuck in the striking exchanges that he can't win. You know, I see Petroni controlling the fight, landing the heavier shots, and very possibly finishing Peterson once he finds his timing. You know, if the takedown attempts don't work early, it's only a matter of time before Vitor lands something fight-ending, you know? Because you got Petroni, who's an explosive athlete with real knockout power, strong defensive wrestling, and he's much more composed nowadays, you know? Coming up against Peterson, who's a pure wrestler, those entries are going to be predictable, and Peterson tends to fold when his takedowns get stuffed, you know. So I see Petroni stuffing those takedowns, landing bombs, and likely getting a first round knockout in this matchup. Moving on to underdog of the week, we got Stewart Nicoll. I'm pretty sure that's how you say his last name. Okay, so he's fighting someone who lost their debut. Stewart also lost his debut, but they each showed flashes of real potential against tough competition. You know, Lucas Rocha, he faced Clayton Carpenter. He's a solid prospect. Gave Tagir Ulanbekov a competitive fight. And despite the loss, Lucas Rocha, you know, his striking looked sharp. He had clean right hands. He had spinning back kicks, flying knees. He was creative and dangerous on the feet. You know, his downfall came from the wrestling. Carpenter was the bigger, stronger man and repeatedly took him down. You know, eventually securing the submission when Rocha couldn't get back up. In Stewart's debut, on the other hand, it was kind of the opposite story. You know, he was actually dominating Jesus Aguilar for the most part. You know, of that fight. With his wrestling and the top control, landing ground and pound, threatening submissions, and dictating the pace. But as Aguilar scrambled, Nicoll slipped off his back and got caught in a lightning fast guillotine. It was more of a crafty move from Aguilar than a major mistake from Stewart Nicoll. You know, and that loss has aged well since Aguilar has proven to be a legitimate talent in the division. Nicoll's wrestling is easily his strongest weapon. You know, he's heavy from top position and relentless once he gets you down. Rocha, by contrast, is a flashy striker who thrives in space, throwing explosive knees and spinning attacks. But his takedown defense is still a glaring weakness, you know. Against a strong grappler like Stewart, that could spell trouble. You know, Rocha is dangerous on the feet. His speed and timing make him a threat here at any moment, but he's undersized for the division. And when you combine that with his tendency to get held down, it's a risky mix. You know, if Nicoll can close the distance early, he should be able to drag Lucas Rocha down to the mat and control him there. You know, Rocha's best chance is to keep the fight standing and land something big. But if the fight goes to the ground, Nicoll's wrestling and top pressure could easily take over. You know, this matchup kind of reminds me of the Mauricio Rufy and Benoit Saint Denis matchup. You know, Stewart's going to look to get this fight on the ground, and once he does, it's entirely in his realm. You know, Rocha, he's a flashy striker. He's got the flying knees, the spinning kicks, but I think he has weak takedown defense. And against a solid wrestler with heavy top control like Stewart, he can grind Lucas Rocha down and wear him down. And I don't think Lucas Rocha is going to capitalize on any mistake that Stewart does on the ground if he does make a mistake, you know. So I see Stewart using his wrestling to control and edge out the rounds in this matchup, most likely finding a submission. Moving on to the next section, we got the parlay section, where we got, starting off with the first parlay, you know, the safety lock, Vitor, Petroni, and Yoel Alvarez. These are my two most confident picks. I got this line at minus 150. When I made the video, it's minus 160. I just checked right now, though. It's minus 190-ish. It's a safety lock. You know, this is your anchor parlay. Both fighters have major stylistic edges here. Petroni's a physical monster with knockout power and improving grappling. Thomas Peterson's wrestling heavy style won't hold up against someone this athletic and explosive. Then you got Alvarez. He is fighting a hesitant post-surgery Vicente Luque. He's much longer, much more active, and, you know, active with his strikes, and he's far more dangerous everywhere. If Luque shoots, Alvarez's guillotine and triangle setups, they are elite. You know, these two are finishers in their prime against slower, declining opponents. You know, it's the cleanest stylistic edge on the entire card, in my opinion. At minus 160, well, now it's probably minus 180, minus 190, but my two most confident picks right there. Okay, moving on to our ultimate lock at minus 130. You got Vitor Petroni and Valter Walker for minus 130. You're banking on two Brazilian tanks, big Brazilian tanks, to handle business at home court. You know, Petroni, as above, should dominate and find a knockout here. Walker's submission game, you know, his heel hook game, it make him lethal no matter at any stage of the fight. You know, he's saying he's gonna go for a knockout here. And if it doesn't work out, that submission is always under his arsenal. You know, 3 straight first round submissions. Usman, he's gonna be slow and hesitate, and once Walker gets close, the fight is entirely in his world. You know, Walker is saying he's going for the knockout, and he most definitely has that in his arsenal as well against someone as slow as Usman. So, you know, both guys, they're physical outliers with finishing upside, a violent yet reliable Brazilian combo at good odds. Great odds, you know, for ultimate lock. Moving on to our affordable juice section, -110. We got Julia Polastri and the Jackson and Figgy fight going over 2.5 rounds. It's a nice balance of value and logic. You know, Polastri has the youth, volume, and better movement versus the aging Karolina. You know, she should control the fight without needing a risky finish. You know, she can just win this fight outright, dominantly on the feet, and no matter where the fight goes. Then you got the Jackson and Figgy fight. I think it's likely to go long. You know, both are patient and technical, and neither has one punch power in this weight class. You know, it's good because it's, well, Polastri and Figgy, they both rely on skill and pace, not chaos. You know, it's strong decision equity. And, you know, the Jackson and Figgy fight, you know, Jackson has that sniping from the outside style, unless he finds a quick knockout. But I think Figgy is skilled enough to not get caught early and extend the fight. You know, and Montel has never been knocked out. You know, I see this fight playing out pretty much Figgy trying to land his right hand to close the distance in order to use his wrestling and find some control time. You know, I think both fighters are going to try to utilize their wrestling a lot in this matchup, and I see the striking being competitive, but both fighters wanting to land their takedowns. You know, I see a lot of wrestling in this fight. Jackson has never been finished, and I don't think it'll be easy for him to finish Figueiredo as well. You know, so moving on to our next parlay, the most confident picks. You got the 4 most confident picks. Put them all together. You got 165 for Vitor Petroni, who has the athleticism of a light heavyweight. You know, you have Yoel Alvarez, who's a submission artist and a tank on the feet. You got Valter Walker, who is a heavyweight powerhouse as well. And then you got Polastri, strawweight volume and striker. It's a balance of dominance type of parlay with realistic hit probability. Moving on to our easy and fun parlay. This is an underrated value pick, in my opinion. You know, Carpenter and Montel Jackson. Carpenter, he's a machine with cardio in his game. He can scramble and pressure to break Jafel Filho's rhythm. And then you got Montel Jackson. I think he's more of a polished boxer than Figgy and is stronger in the clinch versus Figgy. You know, I see Figgy starting to slow down and not being as strong as the fight goes on. So it's a good parlay because both fighters are fast and durable and technically solid, and they are reliable grinders who win by control and accumulation, not by luck, you know. Moving on to our Underdog City sprinkle parlay at +320, pairing Stewart Nicoll, the underdog of the week, with Mario Pinto. This is your chaos value play, and it makes sense. You know, Nicoll has a strong top game and can expose Rocha's weak takedown defense if he plays it smart. Pairing that up with Pinto, who's a wild card. You know, he's athletic, explosive, and fighting another unproven contender in the division. Someone not as proven in the division, I would say, who's he fighting? Jonota Denise. You know, you're pairing 2 live dogs who can win by control or damage, you know, both with stylistic pass that exploit their opponent's defensive holes. It's a realistic shot. I see it coming through. And I think it's worth a sprinkle, you know. So that does conclude this card's best bets for this week. Remember to bet smart, and let me know if you found this helpful. You know, we need lock of the week. Vitor Petroni come through. I definitely think he does. You know, drop your picks in the comments. I want to hear who you're rolling with. But that's it for me. Have a great day. Take care of yourself, guys. I love you. Good luck. I'm out. Peace.